On October 28, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services implemented a new rule that appears, at first glance, to be a routine modernization of its payment system. The agency will no longer accept checks or money orders for paper-filed immigration forms. Instead, all applicants must now pay electronically using one of two authorization forms. Form G-1450 for credit or debit card transactions, or Form G-1650 for ACH withdrawals from a United States bank account. In the agency's own words, this shift will eliminate the need for applicants to bring funds into field offices and comply with a government-wide initiative under Executive Order 14247, titled Modernizing Payments to and from America's Bank Account. A USCIS spokesperson praised the decision as a no-brainer, claiming that 90% of payments currently arrive as paper checks and that digital payments will reduce fraud and speed up processing. It sounds simple, it sounds efficient, and, to the uninitiated, it sounds inevitable, an overdue embrace of the digital era. But to those who actually practice immigration law, who file applications and petitions every day on behalf of clients, the reality is starkly different. This no-brainer may be one of the most disruptive administrative changes in modern immigration practice, threatening to stall or even halt filings altogether. For more than a decade, USCIS has quietly offered Form G-1450 as an optional way to pay filing fees by credit card. In theory, it should be convenient. In practice, it has been notoriously unreliable. Attorneys and applicants alike report that banks frequently reject these charges as suspicious. When that happens, the agency makes only a single attempt to process the payment. If the charge fails, no matter the reason, the entire application is automatically rejected and mailed back. The applicant then loses weeks or months, sometimes missing critical filing windows, even after confirming with their bank that the transaction was legitimate. Experienced immigration attorneys attest that this problem is not occasional, it is systemic. Card issuers treat the agency's charges as potential fraud, and USCIS's lockboxes lack the ability to reauthorize or reattempt payment. An even more systemic issue lies in who can use these payment methods. The new USCIS payment rule does more than modernize a process. It changes who can even participate in it. By requiring all paper filings to be paid electronically through US financial systems, the agency has turned a routine procedural step into a screening mechanism. What once required a check now demands successful navigation of US banking infrastructure. At first, the barrier appears technical. Foreign-issued cards often fail US fraud checks, and ACH transfers require a US bank account. Something most applicants cannot open without a social security number or proof of permanent residence. Those most affected are precisely the people immigration forms were meant to serve: students, workers, family petitioners, and asylum seekers who are still outside the banking system. The common response, "They can just get a lawyer," misses the point. Government forms exist so the public can apply without representation, and barriers that make even American petitioners unsure if their filings will be accepted essentially make representation mandatory. Turning processes into something that only function through professionals violates the principle of public access and privatizes what was meant to be open to all. When a process requires an attorney to succeed, it stops being a civic service and becomes a gated system. Even when lawyers step in, the structure still fails. Attorneys must now act as payment brokers, warning banks, managing authorizations, and risking chargebacks when USCIS declines a transaction. A single failed charge still wipes out the filing, costs weeks, and can ruin a client's timeline. Most practitioners will limit such cases, creating scarcity and delay for everyone else. Without payment, applications cannot be receipted. Without a receipt, no case can be adjudicated. Without an attorney, payment acceptance cannot be guaranteed. It's a closed loop. The result is a double barrier, first technological, then professional. Those without US financial access are locked out entirely. Those who rely on representatives face higher costs and slower processing. A process meant for the public now effectively requires private intermediaries just to function. Modernization that demands a lawyer is not modernization. It is exclusion by design. What USCIS calls efficiency is in practice a narrowing of access. It turns the front door of lawful immigration into a toll gate, open only to those with the means and connections to get through. The agency certainly claims that the policy will reduce fraud and modernize operations. But the vast majority of check and money order payments are already traceable, verifiable, and securely processed. Payment problems almost never arise from those traditional instruments, and money orders in particular were the only surefire way to eliminate funds availability as a potential problem with a filing. Fraud involving checks is vanishingly rare in immigration contexts. The real issue is operational capacity, not payment integrity. The electronic-only mandate does not address processing delays either. Lockbox backlogs are caused by staffing shortages, not payment forms, and electronic payments do not magically bypass intake queues. What they do create, however, is an entire new layer of technical rejection risk. A single failed transaction can now collapse an entire application. This decision, then, is not modernization. It is the substitution of one administrative step for another, except this one is less forgiving, less accessible, and more fragile. So let's take a closer look at how bureaucratic changes can be used to manipulate policy outcomes. It follows a predictable arc. It begins with a promise, matures into a contradiction, and ends in exploitation. The USCIS payment reform is no exception. It can be understood through a simple three-phase model of manipulation drawn from the literature of Depression-era confidence games, a model we call eat 'em, beat 'em, and cheat 'em. In this context, each marks a stage in how ostensibly rational reforms devour the very public they claim to serve. In the classical confidence game, eat 'em is the lure. It begins with the promise of advantage, profit, ease, access, or enlightenment. The mark is not coerced, he is courted. The con succeeds because it presents desire as opportunity and opportunity as inevitability. The pitch sounds rational, even benevolent. The hustler's art is to make the mark believe the offer is his own idea. Eat 'em feeds on aspiration, dressing exploitation as progress, and turning optimism into the entry point of control. Here we find the narrative of inevitability. The agency introduces the policy wrapped in persuasive language: safer, faster, modern, a no-brainer. Such words function less as description than as command. They turn technological adoption into a civic virtue. To question modernization is to oppose progress itself. The rhetorical structure of eat 'em operates on moral framing. It consumes dissent by redefining it as backwardness. The public, faced with the binary of digital the house good and paper the house obsolete, accepts the premise before examining the mechanism. The complexity of real-world conditions, banking access, transaction failure rates, procedural fairness, is buried beneath the appeal of efficiency. Eat 'em feeds on consent disguised as enthusiasm. It transforms modernization into obligation and compliance into moral superiority. What begins as persuasion becomes indoctrination through optimism. Beat 'em is the hinge between belief and surrender. Once the mark accepts the premise, this phase introduces necessity, the appearance that small concessions must be made to achieve the promised outcome. The mark is told that a little flexibility, a slight risk, or a temporary inconvenience is just part of the process. What began as voluntary now feels obligatory. Beat 'em transforms trust into compromise by convincing the mark that success requires obedience. In every con, this is the moment when reason yields to rationalization. It's too late to stop now. Here lies the technical trap. The design flaw presented as innovation. Once adopted, the reform embeds technical dependencies that silently exclude. Electronic payment presumes access to US banking infrastructure, assumes system reliability, and requires error-free data flow between financial intermediaries and federal lockboxes. Each assumption fails precisely where the population is most vulnerable. The system's architecture guarantees fragility. Form G1450 relies on merchant authorization codes frequently flagged as fraud by banks, triggering automatic rejection. Form G1650 demands US bank credentials that many applicants, by definition, cannot possess. The appearance of universality conceals its inverse: exclusivity. A procedure built on technological uniformity cannot tolerate human irregularity, yet immigration is defined by irregular circumstance. Thus, Beetham turns the rhetoric of inclusion into the mechanics of exclusion. It is a modernization that works only for those who already belong. Cheetham is the close, the point where prior compromise becomes instrumentalized. Having enticed and then conditioned the mark, the operator now turns the mark's own participation into leverage. The earlier concessions are reinterpreted as consent. The outcome, however exploitative, is framed as self-inflicted. Cheetham's genius lies in inversion. Guilt replaces grievance and dependency replaces choice. The con no longer needs deception. The victim defends the system that used him. What began as persuasion ends as possession. The mark's complicity becomes the mechanism of control. This is where intent meets outcome, the phase where process becomes pretext. Here, the bureaucratic system converts its own design failure into evidence of user error. Every rejected payment is blamed on the applicant: insufficient funds, invalid account, improper authorization, without acknowledging that the underlying process is engineered to reject at scale. The administrative effect is profound. Rejection inflates efficiency metrics by reducing visible workload. A denied filing never enters the queue, never appears in backlog statistics, never registers as unprocessed. In numerical terms, fewer receipts appear as faster processing. The agency achieves improvement by narrowing the gate. This is the consummation of Cheetham. The policy produces scarcity of access while claiming abundance of efficiency. It hides restriction within compliance and calls the result success. The policy produces fewer approvals but also fewer numbers to criticize. It's like an invisible moratorium achieved through paperwork, not proclamation. The new payment rule will not only harm applicants, it will also burden immigration attorneys and accredited representatives who must now shoulder responsibility for managing these fragile transactions. Many will have to process payments through firm accounts, a practice that's fraught with liability and trust issues. Each rejected charge means yet another round of refiling, couriering, and of course, client anxiety. Even if lawyers manage to find partial workarounds, the cumulative effect will be slower filings, higher costs, and greater systemic drag. In immigration law, every delay compounds. Visa numbers lapse, work authorizations expire, and family reunifications stall. The irony of the spokesperson's phrase, a no-brainer, is that it inadvertently reveals the problem. The decision may indeed have been made without brains, without field consultation, without data, and without regard for practical outcomes. Modernization should remove barriers, not build new ones. But this rule does the opposite. It mistakes financial convenience for functional capacity, assuming that the same digital infrastructure serving domestic consumers can serve a global population navigating the most bureaucratically demanding process in the United States government. If modernization is truly the goal, the solution would be simple. Keep electronic payment optional, expand online filing where possible, and preserve traditional instruments until the electronic system demonstrably works. Instead, USCIS has chosen to enforce a brittle, exclusionary mechanism that it already knows to be unreliable. Every reform has an end. In this case, the outcome is clear even if unspoken. Fewer filings reaching adjudication, more applicants disqualified for technicalities, more work shifted onto already overburdened legal representatives. It is a subtle but powerful form of restriction, bureaucratic rather than legislative, procedural rather than ideological. By calling it modernization, the agency cloaks regression in the language of progress. By labeling it a no-brainer, it absolves itself of responsibility to think critically. And by ignoring years of field evidence that these forms fail in practice, it transforms efficiency into exclusion. This rule does what no statute could. It restricts immigration invisibly. It narrows access not by decree but by design, by embedding exclusion in the infrastructure of participation. Every failed transaction is a quiet denial, every rejected payment an erasure without record. The result is a system that appears open while functionally closed. maintaining the image of lawful process while quietly starving it of applicants. Modernization becomes the mask of contraction, a policy that performs progress while enacting retreat. Beneath this performance lies the deeper structure of control. Modernization here is not a technological reform. It is a socio-technical filtration, a shift from procedural openness to infrastructural dependency. By making civic participation contingent on digital conformity and financial access, the agency replaces a public right with a private credential. The architecture of inclusion becomes the instrument of exclusion. What once defined fairness, uniform forms, standard fees, equal access, is now contingent upon the applicant's compatibility with systems that were never designed for them. And yet, this is not merely a moral failure, it is a legal one. Under the Administrative Procedure Act, agency action becomes arbitrary and capricious when it ignores material evidence, relies on factors Congress did not intend, or fails to consider the real-world consequences of its design. Under Motor Vehicle Manufacturers Association v. State Farm, agency action that ignores evidence or reverses policy without reasoned explanation is arbitrary and capricious. This rule meets each criterion. USCIS had direct notice of the G1450 system's chronic unreliability. It knew that ACH payments require banking access many applicants cannot obtain, and it advanced efficiency as justification while its own backlog data disproved it. An agency that institutionalizes known dysfunction does not modernize, it legislates negligence by rule-making. To understand how data becomes a weapon in this way, we must step back and look at the Department of Government Efficiency. When DOGE was formed, its mandate seemed harmless, even virtuous. Its mission was to locate waste, identify redundancies, and modernize agency workflows. To do that, DOGE analysts were granted access to the raw operational data of nearly every federal office, from financial transaction logs to intake statistics. Their job was not to legislate or to adjudicate, but to measure, to find the hidden pressure points through which bureaucratic behavior could be optimized. Optimization, however, is never neutral. It is a method of control disguised as improvement. Once DOGE mapped the data flows of agencies like United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, it could see precisely where leverage resided, not in law, but in logistics. Payment rejection rates, processing attrition, and intake failures are not abstractions. They are points of administrative influence. By tightening or relaxing them, one can regulate throughput invisibly, without a single statutory change. This is where the present policy sits. USCIS knows its own rejection rates. DOGE knows them better. The data is already modeled, categorized, and evaluated within the federal efficiency framework. Its non-publication is not an absence of knowledge, it is an exercise of control. To withhold the metrics that would expose a systemic choke point is to weaponize ignorance as policy. At some point, the distinction between error and intention collapses. If the agency were ignorant, it has long since lost the right to that defense. The persistence of a policy that predictably excludes, coupled with silence about its measurable effects, marks the transition from misjudgment to complicity. The system knows where it is broken, it chooses to keep it that way. This is the algorithm of complicity. Data becomes diagnosis, diagnosis becomes leverage, and leverage becomes governance. By treating inefficiency as a design flaw rather than a strategic instrument, the public misunderstands how modern administration now operates. It no longer needs to restrict by decree, it can restrict by procedure. A form can fail as effectively as a law can deny. Thus, the question is not whether USCIS understands the damage. It is whether the government, through DOGE's analytics, has recognized that the damage itself is useful, an adjustable variable in the calculus of control. When modernization becomes a metric rather than a mandate, the data that disproves it disappears. That is where we are on the continuum. Beyond ignorance, beyond neglect, at the threshold where efficiency ceases to serve governance and begins to replace it. A government that perfects the art of measuring everything but truth has not modernized, it has mechanized. And what it cannot justify, it will always hide in the numbers.